Hello, friends, and welcome to session 202. My name is Lachlan Mackay, and I'll be serving as the session chair. This session will be recorded, and there will be time for questions at the end of the presentations. Please post your questions using the Q&A feature, not the chat, but the Q&A, at the bottom of the screen. You're welcome to communicate with each other using the chat during the presentation. We have two fascinating papers. Stephen L. Shields will present Translating the Characters, the Quest for Reformed Egyptian. Steve is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association and a retired Community Christ World Church appointee. He is the author of the well-known book Divergent Paths of the Restoration. A fifth edition, subtitled An Encyclopedia of the Smith-Rigdon Movement, is just out from Signature Books as an e-book due to its massive size. Steve divides his time between the United States and Korea, where he serves as vice president of the Royal Asiatic Society and writes for the English language daily The Korea Times. Our second presenter is R. Gene Addams, who will present John Beck's Fabulous Mine, an outpost in the Tintic Mountains of early Utah Territory. Gene is a lifetime Mormon history enthusiast, independent historian, and author. He and his wife Liz reside in Woodinville, Washington. He recently completed his 20th year as a volunteer Institute of Religion instructor. He holds a BS in accounting and an MBA from the University of Utah and is happily retired. Gene has presented and published several articles dealing with the redemption of Zion and the Church of Christ Temple lot. His most recent work includes the return of the LDS Church, 1900 to 1907, to Jackson County and the redemption of Zion in the John Whitmer Journal, the history and acquisition of the original Temple lot property in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, in Mormon Historical Studies, and Zion's Printing and Publishing Company, from Redemption of Zion to Corporation in the Mormon History Association Journal. He is an author of Upon the Temple Lot, the Church of Christ's Quest to Build the House of the Lord, from John Whitmer Books. Gene is a past president of the John Whitmer Historical Association and a member of the Mormon History Association, the Sons of the Utah Pioneers, and the Missouri Mormon Frontier Foundation. His interests, besides family, include fishing and skiing. At the end of their 20-minute presentations, we should have about 15 minutes for questions. Now to Steve.
Well, good morning, everybody. Let me get the PowerPoint going here, and we'll begin. There we go. In September of 1827, after 4 years of reported annual meetings with the Angel Moroni, Joseph Smith Jr. related taking the golden plates from their stone box on the hill Cumorah to begin translating them. He was supported by an enthusiastic local farmer, Martin Harris. Over the next several months, Smith and Harris created more than 100 pages of manuscript containing stories from what became the Book of Mormon. Histories tell us that sometime in 1827 or 28, Joseph copied characters from the plates and wrote a translation. Smith reported that the plates were inscribed in an unknown language. The quest to discover keys to the language began immediately when Harris took the two documents to New York City in 1828 and went to Professor Charles Anthon. This document is one of the purported characters documents, and it's also one of the three main questions that need to be addressed. Is this the original document taken to Anthon? Second, what is the language, if any, represented by the script on the document? And third, what is the context of, quote, Reformed Egyptian, unquote, mentioned in the Book of Mormon text in a couple of places? The characters document has long been believed by many to be the original document taken to New York City. Others think it's a copy done in the hand of John Whitmer. Other scholars think maybe it was somebody else. An LDS lawyer, attorney in Idaho, Ariel Crowley, probably published the first serious study of the document in a series of articles in 1942. He never proposed a translation, but he decidedly determined that the document was in either hieratic or Egyptian Demotic, which could be called, I suppose, Reformed Egyptian. Crowley did a foray into what scholars of his time published on various scripts, and came down heavily on the side of Demotic, but also wondered if it could also be Sabian. There have been many proposed translations in the movement since the early 1820s, books of scripture by the shelf load and revelations by the thousands. But I want to consider 4 contemporary proposed translations of the Whitmer Characters document. They've been undertaken over the last 20 or so years. 2 translations are by faithful members of Community of Christ, the other 2 by faithful members of the LDS Church. The 4 translators have various educational backgrounds, but none are linguists. Several of their books that describe their approaches and conclusions contain repeated testimonials about the truth of the Book of Mormon, or the historicity of the Book of Mormon is how I would understand truth. Some of the translators adopted independent character numbering systems, those being the 2 Community of Christ translators who seem to be completely unaware of Crowley's work in the 40s. The 2 LDS authors generally followed Crowley's numbering system. Blair Bryant, a Community of Christ member and elder in Maryland, spent more than 20 years working on his translation of the Characters document and published this book in 2018. His book is available free in PDF form from his website. He counts 217 characters compared to Crowley's 222. Bryant's chart labels each line with a letter, and then from right to left numbers each of the characters that Bryant sees there. And sometimes he sees characters where Crowley didn't. As Bryant has studied all this, he proposes that there are 20 root characters in all of this, and each of those root characters has a meaning. They're not alphabetic. He looks at the different curves, the length of the different horizontal lines, the vertical lines, and then a few unique shapes, and then gives some Egyptian meanings, and then he has figured out the Nephite meanings as well. Through his spiritual experience, Bryant learned the translation of several characters, those being power, from, the, plates, of, Nephite layman, and prophecy, revelation. He says those words were revealed to him in that order. This experience took place on the night of 17-18 May in 1994. Bryant testifies the experience was of God and declares his understanding of the transcript is beyond challenge. Here's an example of Bryant's translation of a sequence. His lettering is A26 and then B1, 2, 3, and 4, which corresponds to Crowley's 26, 27, 28, and 29. Crowley does not see B3 as a separate character. And you can see in the diagram below those characters how Bryant understands each part to be a different root character, and he comes up with the translation Nephi, which is 1, 2, and 3 in the first character, the, which is 5, people, which is 6, record, which is 7, and all of that comes out. The Nephite record is from sacred plates writings and is to be included in Christ-inspired plates writings for Israel and the Jews. Bryant believes that Mormon wrote the first 4 lines that are a little larger of the characters, and that Moroni wrote the last 3 lines, which are smaller in size. Jerry Grover is an LDS member, lives in Utah County. He's a geologist and an engineer who speaks Italian and Chinese. He's been employed in his professional field, but he's done translation work for more than 25 years. He proposes that the characters were all written by Mormon and summarize the period from the 19th regnal year of Mosiah to the Limhites and Mormon's coming synopsis of the Book of Mormon prophetic calendar. Grover believes that this characters document is an exact copy of Joseph Smith's original. Grover identifies numbers sequences in the document, and as you can see on the screen, comes up with various numbers, and he believes that that all translates into dates that fit the Mayan calendar system. Mary Jo Yackel in 2019, she's a Community of Christ member who lived in Texas for a long time and was very active in the Weslaco, Texas congregation as a Sunday school teacher. Some of my former colleagues from church headquarters who knew her as children have great love for the lady. She has not identified about 60 of the characters, but the ones that she has identified, she believes that they're more alphabetical in nature, and rather than like a Chinese character symbolic meaning. She has not provided a prose translation as the other 3 translators have. Her work began in '94 and continued for 21 years. Her rubric of interpretation is that the Book of Mormon contains Holy Spirit inspired writings of ancient prophets. So with that as her rubric, she proceeds from there. She believes that all the characters are from Demotic Egyptian, and believes that she claims that Demotic was in everyday use before Lehi left Jerusalem, but Demotic doesn't appear until about 650 BC, a short 50 years before Lehi left Jerusalem, according to the Book of Mormon chronology. She believes that Moses personally wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, and he wrote them in Egyptian. She believes the brass plates of Laban were inscribed in Egyptian. She doesn't have any mention of Crowley's work, so she was apparently unaware of that. Stanley Johnson is another, is an LDS he's a late LDS member. He died in 2017. His book was published in 1999. Johnson is known in a lot of LDS circles as an artist, a sculptor, and had some renown with his Native American depictions in sculptures. Johnson and his wife, who co-wrote the book with him, believe that a modern day person could translate the characters, and if the translation was a story, from the Book of Mormon text, it would be further evidence that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. In Johnson's view, the characters manuscript is the very document that was taken to Charles Anthon. Because of his research into Native American style artworks and things, he included Micmac, Maori, Navajo, Ojibwa, Kiowa, Winnebago, Hopi, Mayan, Paiute, and Moki languages, and found different characters from those different languages to develop his translation. His rubric of interpretation is that the American Indians are the direct descendants of the Hebrew nation that came from Jerusalem around 600 BCE. Johnson includes charts that show these other languages. He did an artistic kind of redrew all the characters. And in a couple of cases, he took a little bit of artistic license, but I won't go into all of that here. He counts only 213 characters, generally uses Crowley's system, but he sees one character where Crowley saw two in some cases. The three questions that have to be addressed is first dealing with, is it the original document? The use of the Whitmer Characters document presents quite a few problems. The document's provenance is unknown. We know that Martin Harris carried a document containing characters transcribed by Joseph Smith Jr., but various versions of the characters have appeared in print and in other manuscripts. Charles Anthon's testimony of what the document looked like that he received is very different from what is shown in this characters document. Many historians believe that all these documents were produced in 1835. And also, we don't have any evidence of the translation that Martin Harris took to New York to show to Anthon. There was two documents, the characters and a translation, and nobody mentions the translation document. It's disappeared even from the historical record mostly. We can't verify if this is the original. Most likely it's not. Second, what is the language, if any, represented by the script? The reliance on Demotic is problematic. Linguists agree Demotic was developed sometime between 650 BCE and 400 BCE, but that doesn't fit with the timeline of Lehi, particularly the history of literacy and how written languages spread throughout the world, and the world of the middle Mediterranean especially. Writing materials were scarce. Very few people could read and write. And Demotic went through centuries of transition and refinement. Here we have some Proto-Canaanite alphabets, which were earlier than Lehi. And here's a few more with Greek letters and some of the different scripts that were around. Other scripts would be South Arabian alphabet. This is some more of the South Arabian alphabetic writings. And here's the Sabian alphabet, which several scholars have suggested perhaps could be, and we can see some similarities between the characters document and all of these different alphabets. We also can find some striking parallels between the document, the characters document, and some symbols in Francis Barrett's 1801 book, The Magus. These were reported by B.H. Roberts as early as 1930. Joseph Smith Sr. family has a long history of association with magic, and that's been well documented by others. Finally, what is the context of Reformed Egyptian mentioned in the Book of Mormon compared to Lehi and his family? Modern day understanding of reading and writing and paper and ink and other such records imposes on the past, I think, some problematic ideals. Finding similar looking characters but ignoring the ancient grammar makes an accurate translation impossible. Lehi lived at a time when Josiah was king of Judah. Josiah is remembered for reforming Jewish worship in the temple based on an old manuscript that they found. Lehi's society was based on what scholars describe as oral tradition. It was true for all of the societies in the neighboring countries or nations that were there. We also need to remember that the spoken language of the kingdom of Judah, where Lehi and his family lived, was not Hebrew, but Aramaic. Hebrew as a daily language had gone out of use long before Lehi. It's also unlikely that they used Egyptian because Egypt was under Greek control, and the old Aramaic was being used. The Assyrian Empire, the Persians adopted Aramaic, and Greek was the lingua franca of all commerce in the Mediterranean well before Lehi comes onto the scene. So how do we account for the three brief references to the Egyptian language in the Book of Mormon? I think the explanation is simple. It's Egyptomania. Egyptomania was a phenomenon that was sweeping Europe and America in the years following Napoleon's conquest of Egypt. Jean-Francois Champollion had deciphered the hieroglyphs by 1822, and there was a surge of copying symbols and architectural styles, artwork, and more. Egyptian themes appeared in literature. One scholar has suggested, at least, that Egyptomania was the root of Joseph's continuing interest in mummies and manuscripts, which culminated in 1835 with a very expensive purchase of some mummies and other artifacts. Finally, there's a fundamental doctrine that's accepted by both Community of Christ and the LDS Church, and that is the church's president and prophet is also the translator and seer and revelator, and nobody else is allowed to translate or issue revelations for the church. That was set really early on in September of 1830 by Joseph Smith Jr. So at least on one hand, faithful adherents might well be hesitant to accept any translation of the characters from any other source but the president of the church. That was very fast. Did I meet my 20 minutes?
Nicely done, Steve. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll now turn to Gene.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for the introduction, Locke. As my title indicates here, John Beck's Fabulous Mine, an outpost in the Tintic Mountains. John Beck, photo here, is going to be used throughout the presentation at different times. John Beck's incredible tale and of the fabulous mine he discovered is a story of sheer determination, dedication to an admirable religious cause, as well as financial greed and dissension. Beck's humble desire for a large portion of the stock in this venture to be consecrated for the redemption of Zion is fascinating and commendable. Beck was born in Augsburg, Germany in March 1843. In 1861, 18-year-old Beck was converted to Mormonism by missionaries of the LDS Church. Beck was soon called to be a missionary in his native land. Upon completing his mission, Beck, along with members of his converted family and friends, left Germany in May 1864, arrived in Salt Lake City in October, and then traveled to the settlement of Lehi, where they made their homes. In early 1870, John Beck, intrigued by what he'd heard regarding prospecting in the Tintic Mountains, left his home in Lehi and headed to the mining digs about 60 miles to the southwest. Upon his arrival in the area of the prospecting activity, Beck acquired an interest in the Eureka Hill mine, located on the side of a mountain that would soon overlook the boomtown of Eureka. This is obviously at more of the peak period in the boomtown. Very little would have been there when Beck arrived in 1870. Unfortunately, Beck lost most of the cash he had brought with him in unsuccessfully defending his initial investment. Undaunted, now pitifully poor, Beck stayed on and began searching for a likely outcropping of a potential ore deposit. Beck lived alone in his camp. One day, as he wandered, and without serious thought, located and filed a claim. Beck began seeking a shaft during the waning months of 1870. Other prospectors in the area were amused in his choice of location on the valley floor and began referring to Beck as the crazy Dutchman, a corrupted pronunciation of the German Deutschmann. Unshaken, Beck kept digging. At 200 feet, he hit a silver bonanza. When the news of the successful strike got out, it rocked the camp. Suddenly, Beck was not the crazy Dutchman at all, but rather a genius. Beck quickly was able to attract the necessary financing to more fully exploit his mind. And you can see this photo taken from up on the hillside looking down. And in the middle of that, you can see the head frame. A closer view is more or less like what we started with. In March 1881, 10 years after staking his original claim, Beck reorganized his mining venture and named it the Bullion, Beck and Champion Mining Company, with a capitalization of $1 million. Perhaps the most notable, and I'm going to show you another slide here. This gives you an idea of the bleak side of the mountain and the various mining operations. The Bullion Beck location is down in the lower right. Perhaps the most notable investors were John Taylor, president of the LDS Church, and George Buchanan, his first counselor. Soon thereafter, and without explanation as to why, Beck began reacquiring or buying back all of the issued stock in the company. And by April 1883, they completed the task. Beck then traveled to Salt Lake to meet with Taylor and Cannon, former investors in his mine. 6 months later, Taylor related the circumstances of Beck's visit at a meeting with his counselors and members of the Quorum of the 12. Taylor explained that Beck discussed his personal circumstances and the Bullion Beck mine. Taylor stated that shortly after his April discussion with Beck, he had received a revelation that included the following language, quote, "Besides, have I not shown unto you, my servant John, a way to raise a fund which should be at your disposal for the accomplishment of my purposes," end quote. Taylor then informed those present that an agreement was thereafter formalized and that Cannon and he had become equal partners with Beck in the ownership of the Bullion Beck mine. According to this agreement, Taylor and Cannon agreed to pay Beck $75,000. Taylor also explained that the three men had further agreed in a separate contract to donate 60% of their individual 1/3 holdings to John Taylor as, quote, his personal property for the benefit of the work of God, end quote. The redemption of Zion, the return of the LDS Church to Jackson County, Missouri, was the intended focus of this fund. Taylor then stated that any of you who desire can join with us in taking stock on the same terms, that is 60% going to the consecrated stock fund, as we have done, end quote. Moses Thatcher, a well-known banker and businessman before his call to the apostleship, expressed his willingness, quote, to join the brethren and take $5,000 in stock. At this point in time, the operation was more or less looking like this. You can see a substantial amount of buildings and other activity all around the Bullion Beck property. Now, including halfway up on the right-hand side is the first LDS church out in Eureka. Over the next 3 years, dividends became regular and at times were significant. For instance, dividends totaling $16,000 were paid in June of 1887, and a month later, another dividend of $25,000 was announced. These amounts were substantial in 1887. In 2020 dollars, this would be approximately $1,093,000. You get a little idea. In September 1886, sensing that his health was becoming a more serious issue, Taylor named Cannon as his successor trustee and trust for the consecrated stock fund. Taylor died on July 25th, 1887. Within a matter of months, following John Taylor's death, two Taylor heirs intervened in the matter of the consecrated stock fund, namely John W. Taylor, son and fossil, and George Taylor, another son. Here's a photo of John W. These men, along with L. John Nuttall, Taylor's son-in-law and private secretary, were the designated executors to carry out the provisions of John Taylor's will. The list of assets of the Taylor estate included the Bullion Beck Mine Company stock. The beginning of an internal disagreement among the executors began when the consecrated stock was also included as an asset. L. John Nuttall would have informed his brothers-in-law that George Buchanan had been appointed by their father as the successor trustee and trust of the consecrated stock fund, and certainly would have explained the consecrated stock fund could not and should not be included as an asset. John W. Taylor would have known about the separation of the consecrated stock fund as a member of the 12, but he and his brother included it anyhow. The consecrated stock fund, after all, represented a sizable amount of money, and they were not about to abandon this position. To support that position, the brothers claimed that their father was incompetent at the time he signed the document transferring control of the consecrated stock to Cannon. Nuttall, who was daily with President Taylor during his final weeks, challenged their claim. Without resolution or compromise, the brothers announced they were prepared to sue Cannon to regain possession of their father's consecrated stock, if necessary, and it looked at the time that it was going to be. Regardless, this matter dragged on into 1889. Also in the late summer of 1887, after Taylor's death, Apostle Thatcher approached Wilford Woodruff, president of the Apostolic Quorum, to specifically discuss the Cannon-controlled consecrated stock fund. He told Woodruff, like the Taylor brothers had, that he wanted a return of his shares that had been contributed to this separate fund in his name when he purchased the $5,000 of the Bullion Beck stock. Furthermore, he too was prepared to sue Cannon. Woodruff replied to Thatcher that in so doing, quote, it would be the worst move you have ever made, end quote. Wanting to avoid involving the church and the publicity certainly to be generated, Cannon reluctantly agreed to relinquish the consecrated stock fund to both Thatcher and Taylor in the fall of 1889. We're back to John Beck. Prior to the commencement of these difficulties, Beck had hurriedly left on a mission to Germany in January 1887, one step ahead of the federal marshals, who were intent on arresting Beck for violation of the Edmunds-Tucker Act, polygamy. The dispute over the consecrated stock took place during Beck's mission, which concluded in June 1889. Previous to his release, Beck had received a cablegram from George Taylor, one of the executors of John Taylor's estate, asking, quote, when I was coming home and if some of my friends could meet me, end quote. Beck answered and provided the date he was to arrive in New York. John W., instead of his brother George, met Beck in New York City, along with Alonzo E. Hyde. On the long trip by train from New York to Salt Lake, they had ample time to discuss the consecrated stock controversy that had been going on now for nearly 2 years. According to Beck's recollection, he was told that Cannon had decided to return Moses Thatcher's and the John Taylor and to the John Taylor estate their consecrated stock shares. Beck certainly would have been asked about his interest in purchasing all of the Taylor stock at that time. Beck recounted soon after he was back in Salt Lake City that the, quote, Taylor boys came to me about buying their stock and offered to take $10 per share. Therefore, I agreed to pay them. In an episode that certainly appears to be sheer greed, Alonzo Hyde, quote, called the boys out, quote, of the meeting they were having with Beck and, quote, soon after I was informed they wanted $15 a share, end quote. Without further explanation, Beck reported that he had paid $240,000 for 16,000 shares. That would be $6 million in today's money. Shortly after this meeting with the Taylors, Beck traveled to Logan, Utah, at Moses Thatcher's request to specifically discuss the sale of his Bullion Beck stock. Thatcher told Beck that he, quote, wanted to get out of the whole affair and would sell it to me, all of his stock, for $4 a share, which I agreed to take and pay for, end quote. However, before payment to Thatcher was made, Hyde appears, who was either present at the meeting or in a position to learn the details promptly. He, quote, took Thatcher aside, told him of my deal with the Taylor boys, and then the result was I paid M. Thatcher for his 5,000 shares at $15 a share, end quote. With the consecrated stock fund now broken by John W. Taylor and Moses Thatcher, it was not long before John Beck met with Cannon and requested the return of his contribution to the consecrated stock fund. Cannon later explained that while he was disappointed, he complied. In spite of the internal conflict regarding the ownership of the company, the Bullion Beck mine continued to be a huge producer of silver and lead. Dividends were regularly declared, often on a monthly basis, and ranged from 40 to 50,000 each. In January 1900, the Deseret News reported that the Bullion Beck and Champion mine had paid since 1870 the sum of $2,633,000 in dividends. In 2020 dollars, this amount would be $65.8 million, substantial. Lorenzo Snow became president of the LDS Church in September 1898, and in April 1899, Snow, at Cannon's request, convened a special meeting of church officers. Snow asked Cannon to explain the object of the meeting to those assembled, and Cannon stated, quote, I've been impressed since the death of President Woodruff to transfer to President Snow what is known as the consecrated stock, end quote. Following his introduction onto the subject, Cannon then produced a statement of the receipts and disbursements of the consecrated stock fund. Between October 1883 and April 1899, period of 15 and a half years. He then suggested that the net assets of the consecrated stock fund worth approximately $119,000, including the remaining shares of stock, be turned over to President Snow, worth approximately $3 million in today's dollars. 10 months later, in February 1900, the First Presidency and other officers of the LDS Church held a meeting with two representatives, Cole and Frisbee, of the Church of Christ, who had traveled from Independence, Missouri, quote, to see what, if anything, could be done about building the temple in Jackson County, Missouri. Afterwards, Cole and Frisbee were excused so that their proposition could be reviewed privately. After some discussion, George Buchanan then spoke. President Taylor wanted to create a fund outside of tithing for purchasing land in Jackson County, and he did create such a fund. And the predominant idea was to watch for a favorable opportunity to buy land in Independence. Later that afternoon, Snow met with Cole and Frisbee and graciously declined their offer. In May 1900, only 3 months after this meeting, James G. Duffin was called as president of the Southwestern States Mission, and by December, he had moved the mission office out of Kansas to Kansas City, Missouri, thus commencing the physical return of the LDS Church to Jackson County. After a 3-year search for property that had once been part of the 1831 Partridge acquisition, Duffin acquired a parcel of land in April 1904, of which 20 acres were within the original purchase. The money provided to Duffin for this historic acquisition came from a fund established for, quote, purchase of land in Independence, Jackson County, Missouri, and the redemption of Zion. What happened to the men who had consecrated 60% of their stock in the Bullion Beck company to a specific consecrated stock fund? Well, let's start with Moses Thatcher. Apostle Moses Thatcher had invested on invitation $5,000 in the Bullion Beck stock, of which 60% went to the consecrated stock fund, or $3,000, and stated that he intended to sue Cannon to get those shares returned. Thatcher, besides his calling as an apostle, also had political ambitions. He blatantly failed to comply with President Woodruff's counsel to obtain First Presidency approval before running for the U.S. Senate. He was also frequently absent from meetings. Exasperated, President Wilford Woodruff in November 1896 convened a special meeting of the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 to discuss the Moses Thatcher situation. After a lengthy session, it was decided that Moses Thatcher be dropped from the Quorum of the 12. President John Taylor's apostle son, John W. Taylor, was primarily responsible for demanding the return of his father's consecrated stock. He threatened legal action against Cannon if necessary. John W. Taylor eventually rejected Wilford Woodruff's 1890 manifesto and Joseph F. Smith's clarification in 1904. As a result of these and other issues, Taylor was formally dropped from the Quorum of the 12 in April 1906. George Q. Cannon continued to serve as Snow's first counselor until his death in April 1901. Cannon's resolve in maintaining the consecrated stock fund was commendable. The remaining funds in the consecrated stock fund provided the seed money for the Jackson County Temple and Redemption of Zion Fund, utilized in April 1904 to purchase 20 acres of the original temple lot property. John Beck followed the leads of John W. Taylor and Moses Thatcher, and also requested the return of his consecrated stock after he returned home from his mission to Germany in the summer of 1889. His request was reluctantly granted. Conclusion. Beck, by nature, was generous to the extreme. Beck was trusting when he should have been wary, and at times was outright duped or defrauded by those who he supposed were his friends. In late April 1899, Beck was forced to declare bankruptcy. John Beck, although he had been among Utah's wealthiest men, died wretchedly poor on April 2nd, 1913. Historian Alan Kent Powell ranks Beck with Jesse Knight, David Eccles, and Alfred McEwen as one of the four most eminently successful late century Mormon businessmen. In spite of his financial difficulties that Beck had brought upon himself in his later years, one has to hope that Beck was happy to know that his initial effort to facilitate the beginning of the LDS Church's return to Jackson County had begun, in part thanks to him, in spite of his exit from the consecrated stock fund that he had generously facilitated in 1883. And finally, this is the National Historic marker that goes next to the head frame that tells a little bit of the story of the Bullion Beck and Champion Mining Company. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gene and Steve, both fascinating presentations. Really, really interesting. We have some time for questions. Our first one comes from Bryce Blankenagel. This one's for Steve. Does Bryant give his reasoning for which selection of Book of Mormon English text he used to decipher the manuscript? It sounds like the introduction, but what reason do we have to believe Characters isn't from Mosiah 2 or randomly elsewhere in the book?
Bryant believes his translation is an expansion on the title page, but doesn't go any further as to where that might have appeared on the plates, if that's the direction you want to go with that understanding of the characters. His translation, Bryant's translation, basically was through this revelatory experience that he had late one evening in his mother's home in Independence. And he went from there in deciphering all of those curls and horizontal and vertical lines, etc. So it may come from Mosiah, I don't know, but the language of Bryant's translation is his own. It's not from any either the RLDS or LDS versions of the Book of Mormon.
Thank you, Steve. Let's jump to one for Gene, also from Bryce. Once Beck's mine was established, who owned the supporting infrastructure, stores, sleeping quarters, etc.?
That was primarily owned by Beck also, or owned by the corporation.
Thank you, Gene. And Bryce has been busy for Steve. Do any of these translations compare written examples of Egyptian or Mayan with the Characters manuscript?
Oh yeah,
Or
they do. We find that in the books, the authors will show a character from the Characters manuscript and then compare it with what they think it might be from either not that none of it's Mayan, because Mayan is very different. But in Johnson's case, he's picked alphabetic letters from various Native American languages, including Maori symbolism and some others. Um, um, Yackel does strict comparison with Demotic Characters, and unfortunately, she uses pictures from the Characters manuscript, claiming they're demotic, and that then she compares it to itself as demotic. So she's not really comparing it with, in every case. In some cases she does, but with the demotic script. Grover, he doesn't posit any other than he's looked at Aztec and Mayan calendric systems, and from all that compared the numbers and then put it all on a timeline. That's, I think, about it. I think maybe that answers part of it.
And Bryce had a follow-up in the same question. Do any of these various translators agree on the meaning of the various characters, or are they all different?
There is not one single agreement. I've done an exhaustive study of each single character and how each translator translates it. 4 different takes on the whole thing.
All right. From Mark Ashurst McGee for Gene. Excellent presentation, Gene. Thank you. Could you take 2 or 3 minutes to briefly cover Utah LDS efforts to redeem Zion through the rest of the 20th century?
Beginning with the movement of the mission home, that ties directly, I think, to the result of the trip from the Church of Christ Brethren to the First Presidency in February 1900. It just is, and there is definitely some material available. You can follow up on instructions from Joseph F. Smith to Duffin that continues to point out the redemption of Zion. And they move forward. By 1907, they moved the mission home into independence itself. And also that year, they established Zion's Printing and Publishing Company, and then started publishing the Book of Mormon shortly thereafter in independence, along with the LDS missionary magazine called the Liahona. And all this is all taking place in the early 1900s. Primarily Samuel Benyon comes into the scene, replacing Duffin in 1905, I think it was. And he's the mission president for about 30 years. So he has a lot to do with the development of the movement of the LDS Church into reestablishing a presence in Jackson County. And one of the other ones that I've done some work on was also the establishment of a plow company called Danielson Plow Company, which had also conceptually arranged in 1907 and started to come to fruition in 1908, where the LDS Church actually owned, in part, a plow company south of where the temple properties are today, and started manufacturing plows and other equipment. And that went on for many years as well. And people came out of Utah to fill the spots in the plow factory, and then started actually, both bringing people from without to independence, as well as the increased missionary effort within the Western Missouri area. I hope that kind of gives you a quick coverage.
Thank you, Gene. From Peter Judd for Steve, do you know of any attempts to use handwriting analysis to find similarities between Joseph Smith's known handwriting and the Characters document?
Several scholars have addressed that over the decades. And basically the result of all that study was that that document was written by John Whitmer, and it was in his handwriting. There are some definitely known documents in the hand of Joseph Smith. There's an Oliver Cowdery document and a Frederick G. Williams document, and some similarities, but some differences. I know of some scholars that, and I won't mention their names because they're working, really hard on this project. They think that it probably wasn't John Whitmer, but somebody else. But none of it was Joseph Smith.
Thank you, Steve. From Bryce for Gene. I probably missed this at the beginning, but did Beck come to Utah wealthy, or did this mine and stocks create all his wealth?
Beck did not come to Utah wealthy. He did have some money. That's apparent because they were able to establish themselves relatively nice in the Lehigh area in the late 1860s before he went west, further west, I should say, to the Tintic Mountains. So he did have some money at that point in time. Not poverty stricken, but not wealthy.
Thank you, Gene. From Aaron Metcalf for Steve, did they ever compare the characters to Cherokee?
Yeah, Stanley Johnson is the one who really went after the Native American scripts and did a lot of comparisons with just virtually every Native American script or hieroglyphic or whatever system you want to call their writing. So I think he did include Cherokee in his list.
Thank you. For Gene, from Alex Baugh, was the Bullion Beck Fund used by the LDS Church to purchase the Far West Temple site in Caldwell County?
To answer that question is maybe. The fund was additionally contributed to beginning in the early 1900s by others who left money in their will and otherwise to the LDS Church, specifically for the redemption of Zion. And that fund continued to accumulate. And I've got some material going clear into the 1950s and 60s that talk about pretty much the same name for the fund that was used to purchase land in Far West.
Thank you, Gene. For Steve, from Jackson Corinta. Steve, do you have a personal theory about what the writing on the characters document is?
My personal theory is it's gobbledygook.
Okay. I'll take a point of personal privilege. For Gene, Bullion Beck, where's the bullion come from? Is it a name or a reference to silver bullion?
I have tried the best I can to get an answer to that question. Arrington left a document at Utah State where he started doing some work on this, and he refers to bullion with an initial A in front of him. So A bullion, the mysterious investor. Obviously, bullion is the same name as the bullion itself in terms of whether it's gold or silver or whatever. But there's no definite answer to that. I keep trying to dig for it and see if I can come up with it, but I haven't so far.
And one last one is, I don't know, is Glenn Beck a convert or is he a Beck descendant?
Who?
Glenn Beck, the
Glenn Beck. Sorry, I didn't hear that. I don't know.
He's a convert.
Which
his
I guess
wife
doesn't.
was LDS.
I guess that doesn't mean that he couldn't be a descendant, but probably not. All right. Thank you, everybody, very, very much for joining us today.
Can I make one quick note?
Yes.
The full article that was developed from this theme was published in Latter-day Saint Historical Studies last month.
And 63 pages long, is that right?
Yeah, something like that, yes.
Lots of detail. Well, thank you very, very much, both Steve and Gene, for your presentations, and thanks to all of those who are attending. Session 203 will begin in just over an hour at the link provided to you in your registration materials. See you then. Goodbye.